She is the senior senator from Minnesota and the author of the new book, Antitrust. Please welcome back to the show, Senator Amy Klobuchar. Senator, thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, John. I was remembering the fun we had at Northrop Auditorium at the University of Minnesota.
Even thinking about that night, I'm so eager to get back on the road after this year and come back because it was so much fun. So Senator, thanks for being here. I was eager to talk to you because I feel like for a long time there was this conversation about inequality in this country that focused on globalization and automation. You hear that over and over again. But there was this third aspect of what was changing in our economy, consolidation, that got short shrift, in part because there just wasn't a lot of attention on the part of Democrats on why it was so important. And so you are part of the vanguard that's redirecting focus on this issue of corporate consolidation, corporate power, antitrust, monopoly. In the book, you spend a fair amount of time diving into the history of progressive populism and taking on corporate mergers, taking on the big trusts. What are some of the lessons you learned about what we need to do now when you started looking back at sort of the trust busting in our past?
When you look back, you realize the public was with the leaders. In fact, the public pushed the leaders. They were pissed off, whether it's farmers with pitchforks who are paying way too much for rail rates, or whether it's small businesses that couldn't compete. And pretty soon, as I think you're starting to see, and this is a part of the debate that's getting left out a bit, the state legislatures and the governors started doing stuff in states, including in more Republican states. And of course, they couldn't do everything because they weren't the federal government, but they started doing things, and that created momentum. You had union strikes going on at the same time against everything from the steel trust to the railroad trust, to what you saw with the Chicago strikes at the time. You then had the farmers going at it in Iowa and Minnesota, Wisconsin, and pretty soon no one could say no. And so I cannot underestimate the importance of public opinion on this. And one of the things then happened after that, so we start passing laws, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, update the laws. There's some heydays of antitrust, like the breakup of AT&T. This, you fast forward 100 years, presidents did stuff, they didn't do stuff. The law was pretty good. Then there was a major shift. And so part of what I'm doing here, and so many others are doing in the progressive movement, is to make the case again politically that this matters to you. If you wonder why you can't get a better deal now that travel's coming back, we go back to some problems there. Well, two companies own 90% of those online travel deals that you think you're getting. Or you wonder why you don't have better privacy protections, or that people can make false claims about the vaccine and people believe it because it's all they see when they get their news, because they get their news from social. Well, guess what? There's been no privacy laws in place that are meaningful on the federal basis anymore. There's no misinformation laws that matter. And all of this has really got the signature mark of monopolies. If they got power, they go for it.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges in this conversation is you're describing these big and sweeping forces that many now I think just take for granted. Like, this is just how the economy works. This is how big companies are. This is life. This is our society. You point to kind of, I think, these two shifts that took place, both of which you just mentioned. And it seems like it speaks to kind of, a lot of problems in America. There was targeted conservative enthusiasm and widespread progressive apathy. And I wanted to take each of those at a time. So can you talk a little bit about what happened when conservative legal minds got a hold of antitrust regulation and what the impact of that has been over the last few decades?
Sure. Well, there was this legal dispute between what was called the Harvard School, which is more traditional view of antitrust. This is kind of hilarious about this story. This is based on what the antitrust laws meant. You're supposed to go after monopolies. That's what Adam Smith said we should go after, the standing army of monopolies. And then you had what was called the Chicago School. That was my alma mater for law school. That was a more conservative school that said, let's look at something new. And Robert Bork came up with this new theory called consumer welfare, where it sounds good, but it's not about the consumers. It's about companies, and efficiency is one of the factors. And judges, they got judges on the courts. We get to the Clarence Thomas, Alito era, now following up with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, both of whom had incredibly conservative antitrust decisions when they were on the circuit courts. It was almost like, hey, look at us. We're adopting the Bork theory. They were solo in many of these decisions. And so those decisions now dominate. So why you wonder why this judge in the FTC Facebook case was so dismissive of the case, a lot of it is based on decisions that have been made in the past, as well as his own views, of course, but also decisions in the past. So that has gotten to the point where it is harder to bring the cases. We need to be as sophisticated as these companies that are dominating our economy and giving people less choice and scaring small businesses out of the market, buying up everything in sight. As Mark Zuckerberg said himself in an email, I'd rather buy than compete. Those are his words, not mine. That is not exactly the definition of capitalism. And so America has always rejuvenated capitalism. We have always made sure that we have the next new Google, the next new Facebook that's on there to compete with new features. Well, right now, they're just buying them all up.
So this sort of legal theory takes hold, and yet even through outside of the courts, through Democratic administrations, through Republican administrations, you have airline mergers, you have media mergers, you have pharmaceutical mergers, and through it all, you see these kind of giant impacts on the economy, and yet it doesn't become a big political issue. Now, you talk about in the book the need to make this kind of the center of our political life. How do you do that? How do you start that conversation about like these big sweeping changes taking place in boardrooms, in the stock market, in industries that are nowhere near where you live, and relate it to like the daily experience of being at a job or being a consumer?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, let's look at what if AT&T had just stayed as one company. Let's talk about that. They had what we call a horizontal monopoly. They owned all the phone companies and they owned everything under them. They had no ability to want to really, compete. It doesn't mean they didn't give us some great new products. So what happened is the government comes in, actually under both Democratic and Republican presidents. It went on for a while. And they said, wait a minute, this isn't good for the economy that we don't have any competition. And so even in today's world, there are times when the FTC or the Justice Department under Trump, under Obama, they did step in and they said, wait a minute, this is going too far. When they did that in the case of AT&T, what that meant was they got broken up into separate companies. Long distance rates went way down because you finally had competition. Because of this competition, we got great new products. And that's what I mean about rejuvenation. And that you get companies that are able to meet the demands of consumers. Why does this matter for workers? Imagine if you're trying to get a job and there's only one monopoly in town that's dominating. It's harder to be able to get the kind of wage that you want. So it matters. Monopolies tend to hire tons of lobbyists and say, oh, well, we don't want to have the Honest Ads Act passed. That's what happened to me at the beginning with the social media ads, because it would be so bad. All it said was just like news organizations for political ads, you've got to have disclaimers and disclosures. So monopolies are able to dominate the political, they dominate court cases, and then they start dominating people's heads about, what they think that they can do and they can't do. And it's really been the history of our country. During the pandemic, of course, we needed companies to do online ordering and all of that. They had some great new things and allowed us. That doesn't mean that we rest on our laurels. And we have laws on the books. And with people like Lena Khan in charge of the FTC now, who is an out-of-the-box thinker, and Tim Wu at the White House, we are a small but mighty group that thoroughly believes that we need to do more, as people have done in the past in America, to make sure that we preserve competition. This is about allowing for competition, allowing for capitalism. And I hope I made the case, because it is it's not exactly intuitive when you think about, well, I did get some new stuff and I got some pretty cheap stuff on Amazon the other day. Well, one of the things monopolies do is they give you good rates. And then once they're the only one in town, they don't have any reason to keep giving you good rates. So that's why you want to make sure there's new companies coming in.
One of the challenges when it comes to tech, and I do think a lot of the attention has been directed at the tech giants, even though this is a much kind of larger and more pervasive problem, is when it comes to social networks specifically, the size of it is kind of part of the appeal, right? Like everybody being on Facebook is what makes Facebook a good social media platform. Enough people being on Twitter makes it a good platform. How do you think about the role of kind of reducing the influence and corporate power of some of those social media platforms, while at the same time recognizing like, some part of this is kind of intrinsic. You want a big social network that everybody's on.
Sure you do, but you could have had Instagram got bought by Facebook, right? And even people involved at the time in the Obama administration now say, well, we should have looked at this in a different way. We should have looked back, and we should look back now. Instagram, WhatsApp, all of those platforms could have been competitors. And really, while Twitter gets a lot of attention, that is not in the same market position as Facebook is in terms of dominance. It is Facebook and Google who said to the country of Australia, an entire industrialized nation, oh, if you make us pay more for news content, we're just going to leave. And you might say, okay, great, go leave. Well, Google had over 90% of the search market there. And so there are things that monopolies do even outside of the consumer prices that are really upending to our democracy. And another, by the way, one great example is app stores. So Americans spend 4 hours a day on app stores, and they're kind of like the new web, right? So Google has, and there's just been a lawsuit filed against Google on this, and we had a great hearing, bipartisan hearing on this. Google's got the app stores that are the non-Apple app stores. Apple has the. So what they do is for companies that do business on there, like say Spotify or Match.com, they have to pay 30% of their revenues when you buy stuff in the app stores to them. And there's no one else to buy for the Apple phones. You cannot say, oh, you can get cheaper deals on the website. You can't say that on their dominant app stores. They're self-preferencing. I think you're going to hear a lot about that. That means putting their own products on top or making them easier for the consumers to access than other people's products. So it is to get to the point where you see that it costs you money. It's not that hard, but it's not fair. If you're the one trying to compete and we want capitalism to be an even playing field to get in, this isn't fair because the big guys are going to keep getting bigger and they have a natural impulse and they're doing it to keep the smaller ones out.
How do you see this fight playing out in Congress with respect to kind of partisan alignments? Like on the one hand, there's this expectation that it's going to be harder to get some Republicans to go along, yet we just had a number of bills introduced in the House. Several Democrats from California who represent districts that have a lot of people that work at these companies have been some of the people objecting to it. You have Josh Hawley in the Senate, who is a valueless creep, but sees some political interest here for his own betterment in making this a centerpiece of his kind of political argument. What are the politics like for you in the Senate of trying to build a coalition to pass some serious changes here?
Well, they're wild politics. You've acknowledged that with what you've pointed out here. But I've always believed, and you heard me say this in the presidential campaign, you just keep trying to find support where you can. So we just passed a major change to the merger fees that no one ever thought possible, that I led with Chuck Grassley. Chuck Grassley can be a bit of a maverick when it comes to wanting to do something to preserve small businesses, honestly. And so we changed it so that the big mergers, when people apply for these and they're coming at an unprecedented rate right now, that they have to pay more. That money goes to Lena Khan can hire more lawyers at the FTC, and so that they can get more lawyers in the Justice Department. We cannot take on the biggest companies the world has ever known with duct tape and Band-Aid. So that's one of my major goals right now, is to get this bill passed. It passed the US Senate, went through unanimously. And yes, do I hear some of the more Republicans who are closer to business sometimes, yeah, do they not like this? No, some of them don't, but they will support this bill. They did support this bill. It went through. And so you just have to try to find support where you can find it. And I think the Biden administration will play a major role in this because a lot of it has to do with pursuing these suits. They were started during Trump, some of them, but the work's going to be done during the Biden administration.
I don't think of you as like a rabble-rouser, scorched earth populist. I think of you as a consensus builder. That's the kind of campaign you ran. That was, I think, part of your message when you were on the campaign trail. But when I think of like taking on some of the biggest corporations in this country, I think about that as like a kind of a left-wing fight, a populist pitchfork battle in which you're going to have to make a ton of enemies. That if you're taking on the most power, people don't give up power willingly. You're going to have to take it. And so this is going to be a massive, massive fight. What made you want to kind of focus on antitrust?
I would not underestimate my ability to fight. You don't run for president without being willing to fight. I'm from the Midwest. This is where a lot of this has been, a lot of the fomenting of taking on big interests. You go back in history to, Williams Jennings Bryan, you go to the more current people like Tom Harkin. It was a lot about the Midwest and not just allowing powers that be, before it was the East Coast, now some on the West Coast, to run the nation and to run the economy. So I think I'm in a way the perfect person. The other thing about it is, I came out of business. So I was at a law firm. I understand how some of this works. And someone else that's been doing this is Mark Warner. I don't think you'd think of him as a prairie populist, but he's someone that's been willing to stand up to the tech companies over and over again. I think some of it is once you start getting into it and know it, and I'm chair of the antitrust subcommittee, someone's got to step in. And Elizabeth's done incredible work in this area. Dick Blumenthal has. Corey's done some work in this area. There's been a number of us that I'm not alone, right? So I've got people from the middle of the party and the left of the party that have been working together. But I figure I'm a lawyer. I've figured out a lot of this, and I may as well put it to good use because people are really screwing around with people right now, and it's so easy to do because it's so complicated.
One kind of pushback you hear from some of the tech companies is you're focused on the wrong things. That, like Google, Apple, Facebook, these are big companies, but the United States needs to win a larger fight for the internet against China. They point to China and they say, if you start breaking us up, if you start hurting our ability to do what we want to do, you are going to bite your nose to spite your face, and you're going to make it so that China wins the internet. That's the kind of fear mongering that you will sometimes hear. What's your response to that?
I don't think the answer is that we be like China and that we have basically one company that's a gatekeeper of every single industry out there, which is exactly what's happening right now. And I think we're better off when we're stronger, when we allow for competition. And it is the same kind of thing. Again, I go back to AT&T, that AT&T said at the time, this is bad for security. It's going to hurt us with the rest of the world. And after it all ended, their chairman said they were a stronger company because they had to compete. So that's the first answer. The second one is, this is one part of your part I want to, what you just argued rhetorically, I want to embrace. And that is that, it isn't just about tech, though. It is pharma. You wonder why the price of insulin went way up. You wonder what happened with EpiPens. Well, a few dominant companies were able to say, we're putting the price up now. It's not because we changed anything. It's because the competition went away. And so all of that to me is an argument for making more sweeping changes. I want to do tech-specific stuff. I've worked with the House on this, but I think if we really want to see change, we have to change for the biggest mega mergers. Make the companies prove why this doesn't hurt competition. It's actually not that radical. We have adjusted the antitrust laws instead of making the government prove that it doesn't hurt competition. Make it easier to look back at these industries that we've just allowed to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. It would have been unheard of, 150 years ago or so when they were looking more carefully and had more resources per merger to allow these companies to dominate with 60, 70, 80% market share. So this means that we're going to have to look back by industry. We don't even have data anymore, the government, on industry by industry consolidation. When I wrote this book, in addition to finding 100 cool cartoons, that was just a little pitch for the book, I realized that the FTC stopped collecting industry by industry data because there was pushback by the companies many, many years ago. This is you got to go back to like the Reagan time. And so we don't even have that, but all of this has to change. And I am, Merrick Garland actually taught antitrust. He understands it. You have got someone in Lena Khan that's a true leader. You've got people that are willing to take this on and have the passion to do it. The House hearings last year, there are Republicans, you've mentioned a few, but Representative Buck did those bills with Cicilline. Grassley's done tons of things with me. Mike Lee agreed to do a bill to give the AGs, the state AGs, more power to do things. So there is a lot of action out there. Kennedy and I took on the power of the tech companies and said we should allow news organizations to coordinate when they negotiate for the price of their content. How do you think some little newspaper in Lanesboro, Minnesota is going to be able to negotiate with Google and Facebook for the price of their content? And so that's what we're dealing with right now, and why, I'd rather not do it that way, but they make for the coordination, but we don't have a choice because of what's happened with the market.
In the hopes of making it more central to our political debates, would you like to see President Biden talking about this more?
Well, he has laid out, and they are, I know, working on a competitive agenda. I think he really showed his cards when he put Tim Wu in place and Lena Khan in place. And I think we'll see more to come. And there are things he can do. In my book, I lay out like 8 things in administration, major things I'd like to see a new administration do. And one of them is put people in place and judges in place that understand what the antitrust laws and how they were originally meant to be enforced. Don't you like this, that the Democrats have to go back to the original antitrust laws? And then Congress has to pass bills. And then finally, things outside of the box to encourage competition that I bet you've talked about before. Non-compete agreements that make it harder for employees to move around.
Something President Biden has just said he's going to do an order around.
Exactly. And immigration reform would actually be a good thing because you would be able to just have more people that can work at places and things like that. So what this is all about to me is encouraging competition. And I think people forget that a lot of this antitrust came up at the same time as labor unions were on the rise. And that's because it's about the power of the people. And so it is no surprise that we're fighting on these fronts: antitrust, voting rights, efforts to squelch organized labor. It's really all about the same thing.
One final question. Senator Klobuchar, I was surprised to learn that your prom date was gay. Is that right?
Yes, he was. Yes. Now, okay, where are we going with this? But at the time, I didn't know that.
Right. Now, here's my question. Do you think that there might have been some deep-seated pain in the heart of a teenage girl that came out when you were picking on then Mayor Pete in some of those debates?
You know that Pete and I are actually very good friends. And I actually did an interview, I think it was with Rachel Maddow, when his book came out, Trust. Let's be amused for a moment that his book was called Trust, and then mine was called Antitrust, because the rivalry continues. But I had it right behind me, so it was displayed. A few months back, he had me over for lunch. We, with his dogs, went on a walk. So I think he's doing a great job, and I strongly supported him. So no, there's no deep-seated anger, only deep-seated friendship.
Just the pain of a hurt young girl looking back on a time in her life when she was vulnerable and she took it out.
Oh, there you go. No, because that really wasn't the story of the prom. My high school prom was more about maybe a bunch of the dates of not just my own, getting drunk at the Ridgedale Mall, where we had our prom because no one had raised enough money to have it anywhere else. So we danced around, at the time, the Woolworths and various places. And then my date actually asked another a person's date. Not that I remember her name, I won't say it right now, in her lime green dress, if she would dance in the fountain, because I didn't want to get my pink polyester dress ruined. And then the vice principal, who is a chaperone of the school, asked me if I needed a ride home. But I came out of that, John, to become a U.S. senator. So I often tell the story to students sometimes to say, no matter how bad your high school experiences can be, you can emerge from that.
That's brutal. Senator Amy Klobuchar, thank you so much. The book is Antitrust, and it is a incredibly compelling case for what not only we need to do to take on monopolies in this country, but also why it is so important to our politics that we talk about this more. So thank you so much for your time.